The sun rose over the glass spires of the city, glinting off the penthouse windows of Newsom Towers, but for Ronald Newsom, the light felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. At 9:07 a.m., the air in the executive boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and silent panic. Ronald sat at the head of the mahogany table, his posture a fortress of practiced confidence, until the double doors swung open. It wasn't his assistant with the morning briefings. It was a phalanx of federal agents in dark windbreakers. The lead investigator didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the polished wood, the sound echoing like a gavel. The fraud charges were official. In that single moment, the empire Ronald had spent 20 years building, stone by stone, compromise by compromise, began to tremble. He looked to his board of directors, men he had made millionaires, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. They weren't his allies anymore. They were witnesses for the prosecution. By 10:00 a.m., the digital world had moved faster than his lawyers could react. Ronald stood in his office, watching his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass, as his CFO delivered the news, in a voice devoid of emotion. The feds had moved with surgical precision, and every single one of his personal and corporate assets was frozen. The black titanium credit card in his wallet was now just a useless piece of metal. The private jet waiting on the tarmac, the villas in Tuscany, the offshore holdings, everything was locked behind a wall of red tape. He was a man who owned the sky an hour ago. Now he couldn't even pay for the coffee sitting cold on his desk. The true betrayal, the one that sliced through his remaining armor, arrived at high noon. Ronald had retreated to his mansion, seeking a moment of sanctuary, only to find the grand foyer occupied by a man in a cheap suit holding a manila envelope. His wife Juliana didn't come downstairs to say goodbye. She didn't offer a word of comfort or a plan to fight. Through the process server, she delivered her response, a petition for divorce and an emergency restraining order. She had seen the cracks in the foundation months ago, and had already moved her own life into the shadows, leaving Ronald to drown in the rising tide alone. The house, filled with art and memories, suddenly felt like a hollow museum dedicated to a stranger. By 2:11 p.m., the board of directors held an emergency session via video link. It took them exactly 6 minutes to strip him of his title. The vote was unanimous. The company that bore his name, Newsom Global, was no longer his. They spoke of damage control and moral turpitude, terms that felt like stones being thrown at a man already down. He was escorted out of his own building by security guards he had once personally hired, their faces set in grim masks of professional indifference. The afternoon was a blur of flashing lights and shouting voices. By 3:11 p.m., the media had descended like vultures. News choppers circled his home, their blades chopping the air into a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. Every news ticker in the country scrawled his name in bright red letters. Billionaire Newsom charged with fraud. The visionary of the decade had been rebranded as the fraudster of the century, before the sun had even begun to set. As 6:07 p.m. approached, the final blow landed. His lead attorney, a man Ronald had paid millions to be his shield, called with a voice that sounded like a funeral dirge. The warrant for his arrest had been signed. There would be no bail, no loopholes, and no last-minute miracles. He was told to turn himself in at the federal building by morning. In just 12 hours, the clock had stripped him of his company, his wealth, his family, and his dignity. Ronald Newsom stepped out into the cooling evening air, a man with a $10 billion name, and not a single soul to call his own. He walked toward the quietest street he could find, the weight of his navy blue suit feeling like a suit of lead, ready to let the darkness swallow what was left of his life. The neon signs of the city blurred into streaks of cold, uncaring light, as Ronald Newsom walked aimlessly through the streets he once claimed to own. His legs, heavy as stone, eventually led him to a place he hadn't visited in 15 years. A modest, 6-story brick building on the edge of the financial district. This wasn't the towering glass monolith of Newsom Global. It was the original site of his first startup, the place where the hunger for success had first tasted like iron in his mouth. He stood before it, the shadow of his former self, remembering the night he had sat at a cramped desk and deleted a series of inconvenient records to secure his first major investment. It had felt like a small price to pay for a kingdom, a moral compromise that had paved the way for everything that followed. Now the kingdom was gone, and the price had finally come due. The silence of the street at 11 was absolute, save for the distant hum of a passing car that briefly illuminated the sidewalk before plunging him back into the dark. Exhaustion finally overcame his pride. Ronald sank onto the cold concrete curb, his $3,000 Navy suit catching the grime of the gut. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and dismissed thousands of employees with a stroke of a pen, and they were trembling. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent 2 decades building a life on a foundation of sand, and as the tides of justice rose, there was nothing left to hold on to. He pulled his knees up toward his chest, the fabric of his custom-tailored trousers straining against the movement. He didn't want to be seen, yet he felt entirely invisible. The billionaire who had been the face of every major financial magazine was now just another broken man on a street corner. The first sob escaped him, a jagged, raw sound that tore through the quiet night air. It wasn't the dignified weeping of a tragic hero. It was the ugly, gasping sob of a man realizing his soul was bankrupt. He buried his face in his palms, his shoulders shaking violently as years of suppressed guilt and the terror of tomorrow's prison cell finally broke the dam. He sat there for what felt like hours, lost in a vacuum of time where his past mistakes played like a taunting film behind his eyelids. He thought of the people he had stepped on to reach the top and the family he had neglected in favor of his stock price. The cold of the sidewalk seeped through his expensive clothes, but it was nothing compared to the ice in his chest. In the shadow of the building where his ambition had first turned lethal, Ronald Newsom wept for the man he used to be, and the monster he had become, convinced that the darkness of the street was the only company he would ever have again. The heavy, rhythmic sound of Ronald's sobbing was the only thing filling the desolate street, a desperate soundtrack to his total collapse. He remained hunched over, his forehead resting against his damp palms, oblivious to the world beyond his own grief. He was so consumed by the wreckage of his life that he didn't hear the soft, rhythmic patter of footsteps approaching, light, tentative steps that didn't belong to a police officer or late-night commuter. It was a sound as fragile as a heartbeat. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him, but Ronald didn't look up. He assumed it was just the wind or a stray animal, or perhaps a ghost of the many people he had ignored on his way to the top. "Mister, why are you making that noise?" The voice was tiny, high-pitched, and carried a weight of genuine concern that Ronald hadn't heard in years. Startled, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and slowly lifted his head. Standing before him in the amber glow of the street lamp was a small girl, no more than 7 years old. She looked like a creature born from the shadows of the very skyscrapers he had built. She was dark-skinned with wide, soulful eyes that seemed to see right through the expensive facade of his navy blue suit. Her appearance was a stark, jarring contrast to the wealth he had once flaunted. She wore a long-sleeved tan shirt that was several sizes too large, its fabric tattered at the hem and sleeves, appearing as though it had been lived in for months without a wash. Her matching tan pants were frayed and held up by a crude piece of rope tied around her waist. Ronald's gaze drifted downward, and the breath caught in his throat. The girl was completely barefoot. Her small feet were stained with the dark grime of the pavement, calloused and exposed to the biting cold of the night. She stood there, vulnerable yet strangely steady, her arms slightly outstretched in a gesture of openness that mirrored the image of a lost angel. Ronald looked at the barefoot angel and felt a surge of shame, so potent it momentarily silenced his crying. He was a billionaire in a custom suit crying over lost numbers, while this child stood in the dirt with nothing but the clothes on her back, looking at him with pity. I've had a very bad day, kid," Ronald managed to choke out, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ear. He tried to look away, but the girl's earnest gaze held him pinned to the curb. She didn't look at his watch or his ring. She looked only at the salt-streaked tracks on his face. She took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the concrete, and the space between the man who had everything and the girl who had nothing began to vanish. In that quiet, darkened alleyway, the shocking reality of her presence began to penetrate his wall of despair, setting the stage for a question he never expected to hear. Ronald stared at the small girl, his mind racing through the thousands of interactions he'd had with people in her position. Usually there was a script to these encounters. He would reach for his wallet, peel off $100 bill to ease his conscience, and walk away without ever making eye contact. He waited for the inevitable request for $1, for food or for the spare change he no longer possessed. He felt his hand reflexively twitch toward his empty pocket, a ghost of the power he had wielded only hours before. But Maya didn't move. She didn't look at his pockets, or the expensive watch still strapped to his wrist. She simply watched him, her head tilted with a depth of perception that made Ronald feel as though his $3,000 suit was made of glass. "I don't have anything for you, Maya," Ronald said, his voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and residual bitterness. "You picked the wrong night and the wrong man. I'm broke. I've lost it all." He expected her to turn away, to lose interest the moment the prospect of a handout vanished. In his world, relationships were transactional. If you couldn't provide value, you were invisible. He prepared himself for her to disappear back into the shadows, leaving him to his solitary misery. Instead, the girl took another step forward, her bare, grime-stained feet silent against the cold concrete. She didn't look disappointed. If anything, her expression softened into something Ronald hadn't experienced in decades: genuine, unadulterated empathy. She looked at his tear-streaked face, and his slumped, defeated shoulders, and she saw through the billionaire title to the terrified man underneath. "I don't want your money, David," she said, using the name he had given her in a low, gravelly tone. "My mama said that when the heart is breaking, money is just heavy paper. It can't hold you up." Ronald let out a harsh, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Your mama was a smart woman. I wish I'd learned that $10 billion ago." He looked down at the curb, ready to dismiss her, to crawl back into the hole of his own making. But then the silence was broken by a question so simple and so unexpected that it felt like a physical jolt to his system. "Can I hug you?" Ronald froze. He blinked, certain he had misheard her over the distant hum of the city. He looked up, his eyes wide with confusion. He had expected a demand, a plea for help, or even an insult. In the boardrooms of Newsim Global, hugs were non-existent. There were handshakes, there were legal contracts, and there were backs to be stabbed. But there was no touch that didn't come with an ulterior motive. His wife hadn't hugged him in years. Their marriage had become a choreographed sequence of public appearances and private coldness. His associates only touched him to celebrate a win or to push him out of a door. "What?" Ronald whispered, his voice barely audible. Why would you want to do that? Look at me. I'm a mess. I'm a failure." Maya didn't flinch. She took the final step that closed the distance between the heights of corporate power and the depths of the street. "You look like you need a hug more than I need a meal," she said softly, echoing a wisdom that seemed far older than her 7 years. She didn't wait for him to rationalize it or for his pride to build a new wall. She simply stood there, her arms slightly open, offering the only thing she owned in the entire world, a moment of pure selfless kindness. Ronald Newsim, the man who had tried to buy the world, looked at the barefoot girl and felt the last of his defenses shatter. The shocking realization that someone could care for his soul without wanting his checkbook was the most valuable thing he had ever encountered. Ronald remained frozen on the curb, his eyes searching Maya's face for a trick that wasn't there. The offer of a hug felt more terrifying than the federal indictment waiting for him at sunrise, because it required a vulnerability he had spent a lifetime suffocating. He looked at her tattered tan clothes, and the way her bare, dirty feet seemed to grip the cold pavement with a resilience he couldn't comprehend. He felt like a fraud even in his grief, a man mourning a lost mountain of gold while standing before a child who didn't even own shoes. "I told you, Maya. I lost everything," Ronald whispered, his voice thick with the salt of his tears. "My money, my company,
My house, everything I worked for is gone. There's nothing left of me. He expected her to nod in somber agreement, to acknowledge the magnitude of a $10 billion catastrophe. Instead, Maya tilted her head, her wide eyes narrowing with a gentle, unsettling scrutiny. Everything? She asked, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. Do you still have your arms in your legs, Mr. Ronald? Ronald blinked, taken aback by the absurdity of the question. What? Yes, of course I do, but that's not. And can you still see the lights? Can you still hear the city breathe? She interrupted, her small hand gesturing toward the glowing skyscrapers that mocked him from the skyline. Yes, but you don't understand, Ronald protested, his corporate instincts trying to explain the complexity of net worth and asset liquidation. In the world I live in, without those things you are nothing, you're invisible. Maya took a small step closer, her bare feet silent on the concrete. Then your world is very small, she said softly. I lost my mama 6 months ago. That is losing everything. When she went away, the sun didn't feel warm anymore, and the bed felt too big, and I had no one to tell my dreams to. That is the kind of empty that money can't fill. She looked down at her own frayed sleeves, and then back at his expensive rumpled suit. You lost your paper, and you lost your big stone house, but you still have your heart. If it can still break enough to make you cry like this, then it's still working. And if it's still working, you haven't lost everything yet. The simple, devastating truth of her words hit Ronald with more force than the SEC's evidence ever could. He had spent 40 years believing that his value was a number on a screen, a figure that fluctuated with the market. He had equated his everything with things that could be frozen by a judge, or stolen by a rival. This child, standing in the shadows of his own corporate headquarters, possessed a wealth of perspective that his expensive therapists and high-priced consultants had never even glimpsed. She wasn't looking at him as a fallen billionaire. She was looking at him as a human being who was hurt on the inside, the kind of hurt she knew doctors couldn't fix. She was offering him a bridge back to humanity, built on the idea that kindness was a currency that never devalued. Ronald looked at his own limbs, then at the girl's steady gaze, and for the first time in 12 hours, the crushing weight in his chest shifted. He realized that while he was facing prison, he was still breathing. While he was alone, he was currently being seen by the only person who had truly looked at him all day. The wisdom of the poor had stripped him far more effectively than the law, leaving him with the shocking realization that he was still alive, and that perhaps was enough to start over. The silence of the midnight street seemed to hold its breath, as Ronald Newsom looked into the eyes of the child who owned nothing but offered him everything. The logic of his old life, the world of leverage, hostile takeovers and cold calculations, vibrated one last time in his mind before finally collapsing. He realized that for the first time in his 42 years, he wasn't being asked for a favor, a loan or a signature. He was being offered a sanctuary. With a slow, trembling movement, Ronald lowered his head and whispered a single broken word. Yes. Maya stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the cold pavement as she closed the final gap between the world of the destitute and the world of the disgrace. She wrapped her small, thin arms around Ronald's neck, pulling his heavy frame toward her. As they connected, the physical sensation was a shock to his system. He felt the coarse, rough tan shirt of the girl fabric that was stiff with the salt of the streets and the dust of hidden corners, pressing directly against the superfine wool of his expensive suit. The contrast was a tactile representation of his entire life's contradiction. The billionaire and the beggar were no longer two separate entities, but two souls clinging to one another in the dark. The moment her small hands touched his back, the last dam of Ronald's pride burst wide open. He didn't just cry, he came apart. He wrapped his arms around the tiny girl, burying his face in her tattered shoulder, and let out deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bone. These were the tears he had been too successful to shed for decades. Tears for the friends he had betrayed, for the wife who had never known the man behind the bank account, and for the hollow gold-plated life he had built on the backs of others. As he held her, the scent of the street, unwashed, smoky and raw, filled his lungs, replacing the artificial fragrance of boardroom air and expensive cologne. Yet in that smell there was a strange, grounding honesty. Maya didn't pull away. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him he'd get his money back. She simply held on, her small body steady and patient, providing an anchor for a man drowning in a sea of his own making. She whispered words her mother had once told her, soft sounds that acted like rain cleaning a dirty street. washing away the layers of arrogance that had coated Ronald's heart for far too long. In that embrace, the billionaire died, and a human being was born in the wreckage. The tears flowing down his face weren't just mourning his lost fortune. They were an exorcism of the greed that had kept him a prisoner long before the federal agents arrived. The coldness of the night curb didn't matter anymore. The looming shadow of the prison cell didn't. For several long minutes, there was only the sound of a broken man's breath hitching, and the steady, quiet presence of a child who knew that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value. When Ronald finally pulled back, wiping his eyes with a sleeve that was now stained with both his tears and her struggle, he looked at Maya and saw not a homeless girl but his savior. The pride was gone, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. The street began to feel less like a graveyard and more like a sanctuary. As Ronald sat back on the curb, his breath finally steadying, the girl Maya remained close, her presence a warm light against the cold stone of the buildings that hemmed them.
Ronald looked at his hands again. They were still shaking, but the terror that had gripped him since 9:07 a.m. had morphed into a strange, hollowed-out calm. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with a serene patience, her bare feet tucked under her tattered tan pants. He realized then that he was a man who had spent his life surrounded by geniuses, Ivy League advisors, and world-class strategists, yet none of them had ever looked at him with the clarity this child possessed. "How do you do it?" Ronald asked, his voice a low rasp. "How do you stand here with nothing, no shoes, no home, and tell me that I haven't lost everything? I'm going to prison, Maya. My name is a punchline. There is no coming back from this." He was looking for a logical escape, the kind of loophole he used to pay lawyers millions to find, but Maya wasn't offering a legal defense. She was offering a way to live. She leaned forward, her small face illuminated by the distant amber glow of a street lamp. "My mama used to say that every day is a new chance to choose better," she whispered, the words falling into the quiet air like a benediction. She told him how her mother, even when they were forced onto the streets, even when she was cough-sick and tired, would wake up and find one small thing to do right. Sometimes it was sharing a crust of bread. Sometimes it was just smiling at someone who looked sadder than they were. She said, "You can't undo the choices you made yesterday. They are like shadows. They follow you, but they aren't you. You are the person who makes the choice right now." Ronald felt the words pierce the thick layers of his cynicism. For years he had justified his ruthlessness by telling himself it was just the way the world worked, that one bad choice required 10 more to cover it up, until he was buried under a mountain of moral debt. He had convinced himself that once you started down a certain path, you were destined to finish it, no matter how many people you crushed along the way. But this child, who had lost her mother and her safety, was telling him that the cycle could be broken. The idea that he could choose better even in a prison cell, even after $1 billion fraud, was a shocking revelation that felt more powerful than any bank balance. "I've spent 40 years choosing wrong," Ronald admitted, looking up at the dark windows of the building where his ambition had first turned into greed. "I don't even know how to choose right anymore." Maya reached out and touched his arm, her small hand warm against the cold wool of his sleeve. "You started choosing right when you let me hug you," she said simply. "You didn't push me away. You didn't give me money, just to make me go away. You stayed." She smiled then, a small knowing expression that made her look far older than 7. "Yesterday you were a man who cared about paper. Today you can be a man who cares about people. Every sun that comes up is a new chance. Even in prison, the sun will come up. David, you just have to decide who you're going to be when it hits your face." The weight of his impending arrest didn't disappear, but the nature of it changed. It was no longer just a punishment to be endured. It was a consequence to be met with a new kind of strength. He looked at this barefoot girl and realized she had given him a map for the ruins of his life. He wasn't just a millionaire or a fraudster anymore. He was a student of a child's wisdom, finally understanding that true wealth wasn't about what you collected, but the choices you made when you had nothing left to lose. Ronald reached into the inner pocket of his rumpled navy suit, his fingers brushing against the leather of a wallet that had once held the power to move markets and command industries. Now, it felt like a heavy relic of a dead man's life. He pulled it out, noticing how the high-end leather seemed out of place against the backdrop of the grime-streaked pavement where he sat. Inside, there were no longer the black titanium cards or the platinum accounts. Those had been frozen hours ago, rendered as useless as the pride he had finally shed. What remained was a small stack of bills, $500 in cash, that he had withdrawn for a dinner tip days before his world ended. It was the only liquid currency he had left in the world, money earned before the fraud charges, and the frozen assets had turned him into a pariah. He looked at Maya, who was still standing before him with her arms down now, her bare, dirty feet steady on the cold concrete. She hadn't asked for a cent, and yet she had given him the only peace he had known since the morning began. Ronald fanned out the bills, the green paper trembling in his hand. He thought of the billions he had moved through offshore accounts, the vast sums that had bought him a hollow mansion, and a trophy wife who had disappeared the moment the money stopped flowing. None of those billions had ever felt as significant as these last $500. Maya, he said softly, his voice finally finding a bit of the strength she had breathed back into him. I want you to take this. It's clean money. It's all I have left, but it was earned before I started making the choices that led me here. The girl hesitated, her wide, earnest eyes shifting from the money to Ronald's face. She didn't reach for it with the hunger he expected. She looked at it as if it were just more heavy paper. I didn't give you a hug to get paid, David, she whispered, still using the name of the man he was trying to become again. I know you didn't, Ronald replied, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. That's why you have to take it. You gave me something tonight, comfort, a new chance, a reminder that I'm still human. Let me give you something back that might make your night a little warmer. He reached out and gently took her small calloused hand, pressing the bills into her palm. As her fingers closed around the money, Ronald stood up, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained from the curb, but his posture no longer carried the weight of a defeated man. He looked up at the dark building where he had first compromised his soul and then back at the child in the tattered tan clothes. I have to turn myself in tomorrow morning, he said, the reality of the prison cell no longer feeling like an end, but a beginning. But tonight, I want to do one last thing right. I won't leave you out here on this curb. Let me walk you to the shelter. I want to make sure you have a safe place to sleep. Maya nodded, and for the first time she reached out and took his hand, her small dirty fingers interlacing with his. As they began to walk together through the quiet, amber-lit streets, the disgraced billionaire in his $3,000 suit, and the barefoot girl in her rope-belted pants, the silence of the city no longer felt cold. Every step toward the shelter was Ronald's first real movement toward redemption, a journey measured not in bank balances, but in the warmth of a child's hand, and the quiet purpose of helping someone who truly had nothing. The morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the cold glass of the federal building in shades of bruised purple and gold. Ronald Newsom stood before the heavy brass doors, but he did not look like the man who had sat weeping on a curb just hours before. His suit was still wrinkled, his tie was missing, and the expensive sheen of his old life had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. As he watched the first few employees trickle into the building, he thought of Maya. He thought of the way she had looked through the window of the shelter, safe, fed, and for the first time in months, tucked into a bed that wasn't made of cardboard. He had left her with a promise that he would not disappear, and for the first time in his life, Ronald Newsom intended to keep a promise that didn't involve a profit margin. He walked through the entrance and approached the security desk. There was no team of high-priced lawyers flanking him, no PR specialists ready to spin the narrative, and no frantic phone calls to judges. When the officer behind the desk recognized his face from the morning news and reached for his radio, Ronald simply nodded. He placed his hands on the counter, not in a gesture of defeat, but in one of surrender to the truth. I'm Ronald Newsom, he said, his voice calm and resonant. I'm here to turn myself in, and I'm here to cooperate. Complete. The months that followed were a blur of fluorescent lights, steel bars and legal depositions,
But the man sitting in the interrogation rooms was unrecognizable to the prosecutor. They had expected a fight. They had expected a man who would claw for every loophole and hide behind every offshore shell company. Instead, they found a man who laid his empire bare. Ronald spent his days not trying to avoid punishment, but obsessed with restitution. He directed his remaining legal team to liquidate every hidden asset, every luxury vehicle and every piece of art, to pay back the pension funds and small investors he had defrauded. He became the architect of his own ruin, finding a strange, purifying joy in watching the numbers in his accounts drop to zero as the lives of those he had hurt were made whole. In the quiet of his prison cell, Ronald found a different kind of wealth. He began to teach financial literacy to the men around him, helping them understand how to build a life without the shortcuts that had led him to ruin. He wrote letters to Maya every week, and in return he received drawings of the sun and the barefoot angel. She was becoming under the care of the guardians he had vetted before his sentencing. He realized that Maya's mother had been right. Every day was indeed a new chance to choose better. The iron bars couldn't take that away from him. Years later, when Ronald Newsom finally stepped out of the prison gates, he was no longer a billionaire in name, but he was the richest man he had ever known. He was met not by a limo but by a young woman named Maya, who was standing there with shoes on her feet and a college acceptance letter in her hand. He didn't look back at the towers that still bore his name in fading letters. He looked at the girl who had saved his soul with a single hug, and realized that his legacy wouldn't be written in stone or gold. It would be written in the kindness he gave away for free, proving to a skeptical world that even the most broken man can find redemption if he is brave enough to listen to the wisdom of a child who has nothing.